So, last time we talked about customer discovery, right? And we talked about how do we actually go about figuring out who our customers are. Well, first we take the market segments, but it's not enough to take the market segments. We also have to consider behavior of folks. So there might be some changes that we have to make in terms of who we think is an early adopter. And then from there, we talked about creating mental models, right? And what's a mental model?
Understanding the customer persona.
Developing
a persona.
Developing a what?
Persona, like what
persona, yeah. Okay, but more than that? More than just a persona? Okay, well, I guess.
Get to know the customer.
Like understanding their behaviors.
Right, but in the context of what?
Like their early adopters.
Good teamwork there. Like their, I'm not sure this is accurate. It's hard for me to explain. Like their trajectory in what they do on a daily basis and how the
sure,
not the product, but the idea fits.
That's part of it, but what else? Remember I put up that picture of that funny-looking guy?
Hipster dude.
Right, and what does he have? What does the hipster dude have?
Beliefs and desires.
Right, okay. So I want to kind of reiterate that because that's going to make a difference in terms of how you design things. And then we talked a little bit about how you conduct customer interviews, why you want to first come up with a qualification questionnaire, and then after that only do you go out and do the lengthy interview process, right? Otherwise, you'll get stuck interviewing people for a very long time who might not want to be interviewed, might not be the right candidate, and isn't going to give you good feedback. Okay, so a few announcements before we begin. Quiz 1 results are up, so all of you should see them. And there's going to be 2 more quizzes. If you have any issues with them, you can go talk to Akshay. He's going to hold office hours. I sent out an email to the group. He's going to hold them next week, 2:15 on Tuesday. And if you guys have any questions on Lab 2, you can ask now. Okay, we're going to have to take another pause after Lab 2. I think there's 1 week in between that and Lab 3 because it's fall break. And then pretty much after that, I think we've got like labs that are happening week after week. So just make sure that you're aware that it's going to start clustering. Okay, wanted to bring up that I will be holding a review session on October 23rd. I hope this doesn't conflict with one of the labs. I should double check before I do that. But what I'll do is if you have an idea summary, you can bring it in. I'll spend like 10-15 minutes with your groups, and I'll just go over it before you do the submission. But we're opening it up to everyone, so I'll send over a link where you need to schedule yourself in, and that way you can get priority access. It's going to be myself and Jim Mundell, who runs DoHatch. So you can pick either one of us when you get there. And then if you just walk in, then you'll kind of have to wait, but you can listen to other people's feedback. Okay. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit more about how do you go from stories to features, right? Because last time we said we're going to do these customer interviews, and then after we do the customer interviews, we're going to get a lot of feedback, and then from that feedback, we can figure out what it is that we actually need to build, right? That's why we do the customer interviews. And then we'll do a little bit of usability testing, and of course, in order to do usability testing, we're going to need to have a paper prototype as the first method of usability testing. And then the second level will be interaction testing. So I'll try, if we have time, to get through both of these forms and pick someone in the audience to be my usability tester. Okay, so we're finally going to start building. Hopefully everyone's excited about this. I know Anna certainly was. And just to recall, right, we're still in the customer discovery phase, and we're still concerned about how do we figure out pricing, product, and distribution. And so really what we're doing right now is we're still validating what it is our problem is that we're trying to solve and who our early adopters are. And to do this, we began by conducting a number of interviews. Might have had multiple segments because we weren't really sure which segment to go after, right? And then we formed our mental models based on each of the segments, and that helped us determine, which segments had particular needs, right? And if they had some needs, maybe we get rid of a segment because they just, their needs are really weird and it's going to be hard for us to design a solution that's common for all the segments. And the real goal in doing all of this is that we're trying to validate what the problem is that we think exists And the other bigger portion is we're trying to bring clarity to design, right? So before we start to design something, we really have to dig into who the person is and what they're doing, and only then does it make sense to implement. Otherwise, you're just kind of poking holes in the dough. So this is the reason we do all of this user research to begin with. So we've collected a bunch of feedback, and then remember we said we have to categorize all the customers and all the feedback. We have to categorize the tasks that they're doing, we have to categorize the customers based on their personas, and then we have to match everything up. And we went through sort of these 6 steps, right? We're going to learn what the verbs are, meaning when we interview people, we're going to ask them what they do, not just in the context of the particular problem that we think that they have, but just in the larger context. Then we're going to create some personas, and then we're going to listen for tasks, which is why when you conduct your interviews, you need to make sure that you record them so that you can go back and comb for these tasks. And then, like I just said, match the personas to the tasks, look for patterns. The tasks are what's going to become your end stories, and the stories are what are going to eventually become the features that you build. And we'll explain how that final process works. So everybody in your group, who's working on the product should understand who the persona is that you're going after, or if you've got multiple, then each one, right? That should be understood. And the other thing is that everyone should actually comb for tasks. So it's not just that one person gets stuck with this. And the reason you kind of want multiple people to do this is because sometimes another person might pick up on a particular task that the initial interviewer didn't. So my suggestion is in doing your lab 2, each person go out and do the interview, but then once you've got the recording, hand it off to the other person and have them listen to the recording as well. Okay? So we talked a little bit about tasks, right? It's basically what a customer is trying to do, and you might want to come up with a solution in order for them to accomplish the same thing and give them a better benefit. Maybe that benefit is time, automation, efficiency. And then we also talked about the importance of when they do these tasks, they have certain desires, right? An end goal, or they might have a feeling about that task, or a preference or some expectations of what the outcomes are going to be. And all of these are there because they're going to characterize the need of whether, how important that task is in their lives. Now, there are a couple things that we didn't cover that I want to highlight today. So, we talked about this implied task versus a third-party task. So can anybody tell me what implied versus third-party is?
Implied is when they don't directly tell you
Okay.
what the task is, and
Sure.
third party is like one that's basically a direct statement that this is something I do already.
Right. But what's third-party?
So like, it would be like if like the doctor or something is talking and saying like, oh, my secretary does that.
Right. Exactly. If someone else is doing it, not the person that you're initially interviewing, which means you'll probably have to go out and do another round of interviews with the end user. So there's 2 more things that I wanted to cover, which are compound tasks and vague verbs. So what do you think a compound task is? And why do you think it can affect the design?
Compound, I'm guessing 2 or more things that you have to do.
Okay. And why is that important?
Because if you have to do 2 tasks at once, as opposed to just one of those, then your product gets more complex and has more features that can
Right.
come in it.
Yep, that's a good point. So yes, you're adding a number of steps now into a particular thing that you're trying to accomplish for them, and that, like Earl said, is going to complicate things. It might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing, but you want to understand for them, is it always that they have to have these 2 steps together? Right? So it might be something simple, bringing it back to my Busy Bee example of, when I take attendance and see somebody's expired, well, I want to immediately notify them, right? Because it's just so convenient for me. I don't want to have to go in and look for the customer later and then send them an email. That just takes too much time. It would be really great if, as I was taking attendance, something popped up and said, hey, you're expired. Okay? Just to give you an example. What about a vague verb? What might a vague verb be?
Not very descriptive. Maybe I get ready.
Okay. So it's something like read an attendance report. This is a vague verb because it's not really telling us what the end goal is of reading an attendance report is, or do they have any sort of like emotional interest or disinterest in it, right? So you want to get them to be as specific as possible, or if they're not being as specific, then you want to comb for the times where they are more specific, right? So a better example would be, I want to read an attendance report so that I know how many students have come to a particular class, right? This is a little bit more descriptive rather than just the high level of, oh, I wanted to know this information. Okay? So once you've gotten some clarity on all of the tasks, right, that's when you can think about whether or not you need to add additional stories. Because a lot of times if you've got compound tasks or these vague verbs, you're going to have to figure out how that affects the design as well. Okay? And like we've talked about before, stories are what are going to help lead to the features, right? And then, of course, that's all going to fit into the actual product implementation that we're building here. So I know this is a lot, right? We're not going to get through all of it, but I just wanted to give it as an example because when you conduct your interviews, it'll be useful for you to use a table like this to then, figure out what your stories are going to be. So let's just go through a couple examples. So let's, start at the top. Take attendance for each class. Okay, that's the task that they need to perform, and their desire is that they want to be able to do this really quickly. Right? And that's also something that's important, right? When they express this desire, that means whatever feature you design to take attendance better be fast. And they also mentioned that this is a third-party task. So whoever the interviewer is isn't the one that's actually doing it, someone else is doing it. Okay, let's skip to the middle. Let's look at provide students with reports. So it says something like, if we provide students with reports, they will know when they're about to expire, and hopefully, they will renew their membership. Once again, this is sort of a desire or a preference. They think that if they give students their reports, then they'll get paid on time, and their goal is to get paid on time so they can stay in business. Right? Once again, this is sort of a higher level task, but the initial interviewee might be the one that's doing it. All right, and then the final is that students need to pay. This is a task. I want my students to prepay for classes so that I know I'm getting paid on time. I also want to automatically have them renew. Okay, this is, of course, an implied task, meaning they're not the ones doing it, but it's also a third-party task. I didn't put that on there because the students, once again, are the ones doing it, right? But there's a big assumption here that, the students are going to want to prepay, they're going to be on this auto-renewal system, so you're probably going to have to go out and interview some students to see, hey, is this actually true, or is this just a strong preference that the persona that we described as a studio owner wants? Does this make sense? So it's useful to make these kind of columns. I know it seems like, oh, that's a lot of work, but it'll make your design a lot cleaner. Okay. Is this the same one? Okay. That's not. So then we want to translate all of that into actual stories. Okay, so when they say, I want to be able to take attendance quickly, right, we're now going to translate that into who's going to do it and what's the specific task that they're going to do, and why do they want to do it. So each of the stories has that kind of formula. So the one at the beginning is, as a studio owner, because that's the person that's doing the task, I'd like to take attendance quickly before class starts to keep track of students' memberships. Okay? Then skipping down to the one provides students with reports. As a studio owner, I'd like to send students a report so they know when they're about to expire and will pay on time. And then the final, as a studio owner, I want all students to prepay for class packages, and I want to provide an option to do this automatically. Okay, does this make a little bit more sense? Like, you kind of have to go through this step of creating the sentence in order to know who's going to do it, why they're going to do it, and once again, how they're going to do it. So what ends up happening is when you create this laundry list, right, you see there's a lot of stuff that you have to implement. And sometimes you can't if you're really constrained on time. And this is why you take the time to do this. Because in the case where you do end up with this really long list, you've got to go back and figure out how many resources do we have, how can we prioritize the feedback that was given to us, and then pick the stories and build only those that had the highest priority. Right? And usually the highest priority is going to be based off of what they indicate as a strong preference. However, there are times where that's not always the case. Right? Meaning you might have to build some infrastructure. You might have to build some things that feed into another type of feature. So keep those in mind as well. Okay, so for example, on this thing, I just went ahead and highlighted it. Like for the studio owner, the things in red, those are top priority. They've got to notify people of expired memberships, and they've got to collect money. But in order to be able to do these two tasks, we've got to be able to take attendance so that we know when someone's expired, and we've got to be able to enter new students. Okay? So if we don't build those two features, we're not going to be able to build these other two features. Does this make sense? Okay. So the thing that you want to do is, in order to figure out how the logical groupings happen, you're going to want to group the tasks based on the patterns and then see if there are any connections, right? There are certain stories that you're going to have to build before you can build others in order to have a product that actually makes sense to the end user. So this is why it's important to think about mental space. And by mental space, this is why in our customer interview we create a mental model, and like some of you said, we have to figure out the journey of how they interact with our potential product or what their day-to-day is like, right? So this is basically the same thing. We want to figure out what mental space they're in when they're performing a certain type of task. Okay, and some ways to think about that, and here's an example, is when I'm entering student information, I might be in one particular type of mental space. When I'm taking attendance, I might be in another, right? I might just have like a brand new student that walks in, I want to enter their info, that's it. But then when I get ready to start class, that's when I want to take attendance. And then finally, I might be like, sitting on my couch at home and reviewing my attendance later on, right? So mental space sometimes can obviously be determined by time, right? Are people doing these tasks at different points in time? Same thing with collecting payments, reviewing expired memberships, and notifying students who are expired, right? These things don't necessarily have to happen at the same time as the things on the top, okay? So figure out, are there going to be pauses in between the type of tasks that people are doing, right? Or is there some sort of chronological order, right? Like I said, a lot of times people are going to want to enter their student info, and then they're immediately going to want to take attendance. And then the final is there a data flow, which I kind of alluded to before, right? Like you're going to have some of these features or stories contingent upon data from a previous task. So you'll also need to figure out how you're going to model the data. Okay? Now, one thing I'll say is, when I put this up there, for all of you people who are like CS majors, this doesn't mean that you take this and like immediately plug it into a database or something like that. It's completely different. This is the model that a user sees. Sometimes it's a one-to-one correlation, but not always. Okay, and since this isn't a CS class, I won't get too into that. But the reason I bring this up is because this is a data model that a lot of times designers will use in order to figure out how they're going to architect information so that it makes sense to an end user, not to an engineer, to an end user. Okay? And why I say that is because sometimes you have to aggregate data, sometimes you have to separate data, sometimes you have to create hierarchies of data in order for the end user to understand. So, just to give you another example, right? The we're going to enter the student information first, then we're going to take attendance, and then we're going to review attendance. So, in order to even get from step 1 to step 2, right, the first set of data we're going to need is student information. And then, if we assume that they're on some sort of membership, well, we need to know what that membership is. So we might have to figure out how to create a package, and then put that package that was purchased. And then they might have some expiration date associated with it. And then from that, we can go to the next step, which is, okay, we're going to take attendance, but what are we taking attendance for, right? Well, there's going to be class information, there might be instructor information, and then finally there's going to be the student's attendance itself. Does this make sense? Okay. Has anybody done this before? Yes? No? Nobody? Okay. Raise your hands or put them down. Nod of heads is confusing. Okay, a couple of people. Okay, so the reason that you're going to do this is because, once again, now you're going to have to go back and refine your stories, right? Now you've got a whole new set of stories, and that set of stories is contingent upon all this data getting into the system, right? That's what I said a few minutes back, where sometimes you're going to have to build some infrastructure. This is the infrastructure you're going to have to build so that you're going to have now even more stories. And the reason you do this is now you start to see how your story lists can really grow, right? So to build one tiny feature, like, oh, we just want to take attendance. Oh, look at all the things we have to do, right? And the reason that we want to do all of this, I'll explain when we get to product management, is to avoid scope creep. Okay, so let's assume now, we've kind of boiled it down to a few stories. We're going to refine our story. So before we just said something like, well, we want to take attendance, right? But now we're going to be more specific. Or we just said we want to enter customer data, but now we're going to be more specific. We're going to say we want to enter their first name, their last name, their email, and their home address. And when we put it like this, it does two things, right? It makes it very clear everything that needs to happen in order for this story to be complete, right? And the other is that this story can then go to an engineer, and then they know, oh, okay, these are the 4 things that I have to put into the product. Okay? So it makes it clear not only to the product person that's designing it, but also to the engineer that's building it. Now, sometimes you have to get even more granular than that, right? So in this case, as a studio owner, right, if students don't provide me with a valid email address, I'd like to be notified. So now the studio owners also expressed another preference, where they don't just want to take the email, they want to make sure that their students aren't just giving them some hokey email. So now you're going to have to add an additional story here that says, as a busy bee, I need to validate a student's email address once it's entered into the system by a studio owner. So once again, we're getting more stories here. Okay, same thing again. I'd like to take attendance for each class taught, but what's the data we need to include? Well, we need to know what the date, the time, the instructor is, and who the student attended the class. Okay? And only if we take all of this will it then make any sense later on for doing reporting, for figuring out who's expired. So, like I just said, right, the reason you want to get really granular in doing this is because it's going to help you avoid scope creep. Okay? And it's also going to help you to then convey design details very, very early on. Now, I'm just giving you this as a very simple example, but the same thing happens in any other product that you build, whether it's hardware, software, or a consumer good. Right? In all of those cases, there's always going to be some sort of experiential preference that an end user has, and then you're going to have to figure out how can we fit that into a particular task. Does that make sense? Okay. So now we've got to implement all of this, all these stories, and then we've got to go out and collect feedback. Now, you don't have to implement all of it in the sense like, okay, we've got to build this whole monolithic system, right? Maybe we decide to do part of it, go and talk to a few users, and then come back. But, this isn't complete by any means. So, given the tasks, if we still have multiple user segments, we're going to have to go and test what our product implementation is across all of those various user segments. Okay? So last time, when we talked about user research, right, we did the first, in the second column, the first box, where we did preference interviews, right? So we went out and talked to folks. Now we're going to get into just usability testing, right? And the reason that we're doing usability testing is because we want to figure out, how people are going to interact with the product, how they feel about the layout, and then, figure out what's understood or not understood when they use the tool. Okay, so now we're evaluating something different. Before we were evaluating their preferences, now we're evaluating the actual implementation of our product. So to begin, our first way of doing usability testing is paper prototyping. Okay, so what's paper prototyping? Who knows what paper prototyping is?
So it's an app, you draw it out, and with all the different screens, and you basically hand them the next sheet of paper, or they know that they need to go to the next sheet of paper when you press a certain button.
Sure.
Or something of the sort.
Yep, it's basically just mimicking what the actual product would be like on paper. And the reason that you do this is because it's meant to be, like I said, a form of usability testing, and you want to give them a representation of how there might be some interactions or some tasks that they're doing, right? But really, they're just manipulating paper as the interface. So, Tito and I were having this discussion earlier. Why paper, right? Why do we want to do this on paper? We're all engineers, most of us in here are engineers. But you just go out and build a prototype, like an interactive one. Maybe it would take a day. Why do we want to use paper?
It's quick and you can change it.
Right.
It's not precious.
Exactly. So even though you might be able to change your code really quickly, right, it's still a little bit more work than you think. But with paper, you're going to be able to iterate faster. So those are the first two. That's quick and cheap to iterate. But the second is you avoid what's called opinion wars. Who can tell me what an opinion war is?
Maybe if you go too far down the line and somebody disagreed with what you did, and it turns into a war rather than if it's on paper, you can just...
Right. Exactly. Right? They're going to be like, why is this button pink? And you're like, that's not what we're testing here. Like when we get to the later iterations, we'll test that. But right now, I just want to know, does this button even make sense here? Right? So opinion wars are when people start to like think of other things that don't need to be thought about, and that's why we do things on paper. And to answer your question, Tito, it's when you do things that look like it's hand-drawn, it's so that people think, oh, this is hand-drawn. So they're not going to nitpick on like, oh, why does this person have such terrible penmanship? Hopefully they won't, right? But when you do things that emulate the system really closely, then they think it's an actual system, then they start to critique it more harshly. The other is that you really want to focus on the workflow here. Okay, that's what you care about understanding. And then the other thing is, like, one time when I did this and I had the same notion, oh, I'll just like show them an app, right? I got the feedback, I don't know how to use a Mac. And I was like, okay, I should have done this on paper, right? So a lot of times people, need to be system agnostic in the beginning before you dig into building an interaction.
Everybody knows how to use paper.
Exactly. And hopefully by this point in humanity, everybody knows how to use paper. And then of course, once again, the purpose is that you're going to be validating the stories. So just using paper is simple enough validation. So how do we design the interface on paper? I don't just mean draw. There's more that goes into it. Okay? So you're still going to have sort of the same rules. You're going to need to design, even on paper, with specific elements in mind. So if you make a button, that button needs to look like a button on every page that you design, right? Don't make it look like one thing on one page and another on the other, unless it's meant to be different, right? But think about how you can create some standards. Same thing for links or pictures or whatever else that you're doing, right? Make sure that there's some sort of convention when you're even creating it on paper. And then the second thing is, once again, there's going to be some level of interactions, right? So when somebody clicks on something, you might say, okay, here's the next piece of paper, right? Simple enough. Now, a lot of times I get this question like, well, the interface is so small when I design something on mobile versus web. And I would say, it doesn't have to be pixel perfect. But, take your iPhone if that's what you're going to be designing, if you're designing a mobile app, and just like trace it out and make sure that's the space that you decided to use for your paper prototype, right? Try to get as close to, close to the convention as possible. Okay, so how do we now do usability testing? Has anybody ever done usability tests before? Okay, a few of you. So obviously you're going to start with a sample design. It's going to have some interactions on it. And then there are certain things that you want to think about. So you need to figure out how you're going to do the testing and what is it that you're trying to measure when you test, and then how you're going to take the feedback that they give you and then convert that into the next iteration of design, right? So these are some things to think about as you're doing the testing. It's not enough to just show them the paper and get a thumbs up or thumbs down. You're going to want to iterate on this, and so once again, you're going to need to record their feedback. The other thing you want to do is you want to set some goals, right? What is it that you're trying to test here? You might have something very specific, not just the concept, because hopefully you would have already validated the concept in the customer interview, right? So that's not what you should be doing here. Instead, you should be doing things like, does the copy make sense, right? Or are the words on the buttons confusing to people, right? So that's an easy question to ask. Is the design clear, right? Do they feel like this button actually is a button? Or are they like, oh, I would never think to like click this and take me to the next page. That just seems really weird. And then another really important question to ask at the very end is, what's missing, right? And the reason I bring this up is because this is why you want to have continuity in the people that you talk to, right? The person that you do the interview with would have expressed some preferences and tasks and all of that. And so now when you ask them what's missing, they can go back and reference, oh, what was important to me when I did some sort of task, and is that same thing here, or is it not? And if it's not, then you take that feedback and you need to include it in your design next time.
Can you go over copy again?
Copy is just words.
Oh, what's written, right?
Yeah. So does that make sense? Or are you using words like that they wouldn't understand? Right? If you say cancel, they're like, oh, so does this like mean that it doesn't save anything, or it takes me to the next page? Like, what's the behavior? But also sometimes you want to use their own jargon, and you want to make sure it makes sense to them. Okay. So there's multiple steps to doing a usability test. And the first is you're going to explain the product, right? So you're going to say, hey, we know that you're a yoga studio owner, and that one of the big things that you expressed as an issue was that you wanted a way to take attendance, to keep track of memberships, and then, of course, use that to get paid on time. So we've designed a very simple interface here that we'd like you to test out. Okay, and then explain to them that the feedback that you give us in this test is going to be useful to building out the product for studio owners like you and everyone around the world, right? Give them a good feeling of contribution. And then the second thing is set their expectations, right? And I say this because a lot of times people, I don't know why, but you give them a piece of paper and they think that they're taking a test. So make them not only feel comfortable, but explain to them you're not testing them, you're testing the piece of paper. So if something doesn't make sense, it's not their fault, it's the designer's fault, right? So make sure you explain that so that they will give you feedback that actually makes sense. And then finally, what is it that you're testing? Like I said in the last slide, tell us if there's any copy that doesn't make sense, tell us if there's any interactions that don't make sense, tell us what's missing. And then, of course, once it's done, you can thank them for their time, and then it's important to set a follow-up saying, hey, I'm going to come back in about a week or two with an interaction, and you're going to have to click through on an actual screen this time. Okay? So we're going to do a demo in class today.
Can I ask them?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I feel like for the usability test, if you focus exclusively on the front end,
Yeah.
what about if the thing you're designing has a very heavy back end as well? How would you incorporate customer features in sort of designing the infrastructure of the product?
You mean like how are you? Give me an example.
So like say if you had like a particular algorithm that you're using to generate the results you would see on a mobile app, for example.
Yep.
But you don't know which features to pinpoint yet because you don't know like what are some of customers' preferences, and like what people want is sort of part of the what people want is the outcome of your algorithm, but you don't know what they want, and you also don't know what sort of input they want into. Does that make sense?
No.
That's like not making sense. It's just like I guess like the back end in terms of what I'm describing is like the algorithm you're designing is weighs a lot on people.
Input,
Yeah.
right. So you want to, so that's fine. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to have some canned workflows.
Okay.
Okay? So a simple canned workflow that I'll give you an example of is like when we did Mint, right?
Yeah.
Depending on what the transaction was and the description, we'd go back and categorize it. And we'd say like, oh, this person purchased shoes or fast food or whatever, right? So we would just like show them some description string. It's canned, right?
Yeah.
And then be like, okay, here's what the results are that show up. So you kind of have to fake stuff like that.
Okay.
And if you find that stuff gets that granular, then it's probably best to either do it as an interaction design or try to validate some of it in the interview phase itself.
Okay.
Okay, like if you enter, I mean, you can't really ask this question if you entered, but what would you expect if you had X, Y, and Z, right? So get a level of feedback from them earlier,
Okay.
if possible. But if not, I think that's the kind of thing that you want to wait until you do an interaction design so that they can get. But even in an interaction, you can't really automatically populate it with data. So sometimes that's the kind of thing where you have to wait until you have a first prototype, like an actual prototype out. Yep. Or what you can do is you can do a simulation.
Okay.
So I don't have a way, we don't have a tool that we're going to use in this class, but that might be something to think about. Like you might want to think about how you can create a simulation. And I think once again, it's going to come down to building an actual prototype and having some canned responses to that. I think if you're building like an iPhone app, I think there are some things that give you, there's a way to do simulations.
Yeah.
But for other things, I'm not 100% sure how you would simulate it. I mean, basically, you would just populate it with some fake data. Okay. So, who wants to be my usability tester? Okay. Krill, come up.
Do I have to tap the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So, are you gonna interview me, or?
Well, okay, yeah. We'll pretend like this is a real interview. Okay, so we'll be like, hey, Krill, thanks for taking the time to do this usability test with me today. This is just a simple mobile app, and basically what this mobile app does, since you're a yoga studio owner, is that it lets you record all of your students and take attendance, and that's basically it. Okay, so I know we talked about some advanced functionality in our interviews, but we haven't built that out yet. We just wanted to see if the look and the feel of this first prototype that we're putting out makes sense. So the feedback that we're looking from you as you're doing this is, what doesn't make sense in terms of the workflow, if there's copy that's confusing, or any of the elements on here that you're just not sure about, if there's like a button or a link or something, feel free to ask. But in general, I just want you to interact, and then I'm going to step back. I'm not going to interject a whole lot. Okay?
Okay. Do I have an account already?
You tell me what you want to do.
Well, the first thing I want is that I don't have an account. So
Okay.
clearly, I would want to create one.
Okay.
And I want to sign up for free as opposed to not for free.
Okay.
If that's possible.
Sure.
So basically, what I do is fill out my first name, my business name, and click the register button.
Okay.
And that's it.
Okay.
And it's free.
Yep. Okay, then you're going to see this screen.
It's blank.
That's right.
I don't like blank screens. I don't know what to do.
Okay, cool.
So therefore, what I would do is apparently I'm forced to take attendance or find numbers. I wish one of these things was pre-selected for me already.
Okay.
What does history mean?
Oh, great. Yeah. No, it's a good question. So history means that you can go back and look at the classes that you took attendance for and see how many people attended and who attended.
And if I click in numbers, what will happen?
Well, let's find out.
Okay. So I'm guessing if I click into what happens when I click into a number? Are these the classes that you've taken?
Yes.
Okay. I wish this information was actually in the list of things, so I could see like the last class. So if we go back one to all numbers, if I could see that in the underneath Abigail Albright that she's coming,
Oh,
that
when
she's
she
relevant
came. Yeah.
to me.
Cool.
Because if there was like 50 people or 60 people,
Yeah.
like I normally have in my yoga studio,
Right.
I would want to see which ones of them I just buy my product so I don't come.
Okay. So you want some sort of sorting is what you're asking for.
Yeah, I'd like to be able to see at least some relevant piece of information so I'm not just staring at a list of names.
Cool. Okay, that's great feedback.
Maybe an image of the person, so
Okay.
I don't know about everybody by name, but I know by face.
Okay. I'll record that.
Hey, can we see what happens when you take attendance?
Sure.
There are way too many controls on this page.
Okay.
So I can go back to the.
I'm getting grilled.
So let's just say that it looks like I came from history here, which is a little bit confusing to me. As a standard UI element, apparently I can edit the attendance.
Okay.
Okay, so what's the difference between attendance edit when I click the edit or the plus? Is that the same thing?
So when you click the plus, that basically adds a new event. So let's say you're doing a 6 o'clock class.
Okay.
You want to, and it's a new class that you're teaching. You want to take attendance for that class. You click on the plus.
Can we go back to the attendance screen?
Yes.
Yeah, it feels like there's way too many controls, and I'm not sure exactly what I should be doing on this page. There's also, I'm guessing this is like the list of the current upcoming class and who was either signed up to do it or something like that. It's not made very clear to me what that entire thing is. I'm not sure why I should enter your members name when I have a whole category called members where I can enter those people's names. I'm also not sure what these negatives on each of these mean. Does that mean I remove these people?
Yes.
Also, can I click into an already existing event somehow? Because this edit button looks a little bit weird because I want to edit a particular event as opposed to, I'm not exactly sure how I would edit a particular event.
So if you want to edit a particular event, that's when you go to history.
Okay.
And then here there's 3 classes that you've taught. So then you can click on any one of them.
So I guess what's screwed up in my head is the mental model of how do I get to, what is the edit theme in the attendance thing? Because it feels like I would be editing the particular events on that page, because that's a fairly common, I guess, thing to do
Okay.
in apps.
Sure.
Okay. So why can I add things to history? That doesn't make any sense to me because history is what is past. as
Well,
opposed to what is future.
well, remember last time, Phil, in our interview, you mentioned sometimes you can't take attendance in class. You get so busy, or you're running around, and maybe you'll come back later. You'll put out like a sign-up sheet or something, and you'll come back later, and you'll take attendance for them. Or you might have another instructor who's going to put out a sheet of paper, and then they're going to give you their piece of paper later. So we were trying to emulate that behavior
So
here.
the ideal workflow for me is that I first, so I don't do anything with the app. I only use the app after the class.
Well, that's up to you, but based on our interview, we thought there were 2 workflows. One where you got the app and you're taking attendance immediately, and then another where you might not have the time, or hey, you might forget your iPhone, and then you need to go back and do it. So.
Okay, I guess the name confuses me.
Okay.
And I guess the fact that those negatives are showing up already feels really weird to me because I feel like I should delete something because it's the
Oh, I see. Okay.
as opposed to doing something
Okay, so
else.
if you were in edit mode, then the negatives showed up. That would be a little bit
Yeah,
clearer.
that would make sense.
Okay, that's good feedback.
I'm guessing this is a UI. Okay, I guess I am satisfied.
All right.
You don't seem satisfied.
I don't think you're satisfied with
You
the
seem
thing.
very upset with it.
All right. So from that, you get a sense, right? I got a lot of feedback. Right, I got what was confused, like attendance history didn't make sense in terms of the copy. I got like the negative symbol didn't make sense.
I just want to ask like a general question about this process. How much attention should we focus on I know the main goal would be like looking at functionality and looking at the features, but should we only focus on like the style or design or interface?
Not at this stage yet. Not at this phase. So in this phase, it's just purely the functionality and the workflows. After this, which we won't get into because not everybody in here is a designer, we would do something like high fidelity, where we would put, colors, and we would not make this look like it was hand-drawn, but an actual app, right? And then people can tell us how they feel about, those kinds of things. But that's a much later phase. It's usually one before you build the actual prototype. And a lot of times you do that because you want to test branding, or you want to test like error conditions. If you show a little message, does that make sense to people, or are they like, whoa, I hate that red copy, that's awful, right? You want to get that kind of feedback. So, yeah.
In your experience, does paper prototyping work well with desktop website testing and things like that as well?
Yeah, I use it for website. Yeah, I can put up an example of one. This is a product I'm working on right now, so I thought I would try it out. But yeah, in Balsamiq you can do a tabbed view or whatever navigation you want for a website as well. So, yeah, you can choose between iPhone or website. Yeah.
Was that screen with attendance rated negative signs? So it's the idea that if you have a list of 50 names, it's easier to just remove people that aren't there as opposed to
Yes.
having people that are there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Go ahead, and then Anna.
Would you A/B test at this point?
No.
Or no? Like even your paper prototypes?
No, that's a complete waste of time.
Okay.
So, well, no, I mean, okay. There's a lot of debate on this. In general, I find this is just a Poornima philosophy. A/B testing you want to save when you have like thousands and hundreds of thousands of customers, and there will be a significant difference. Okay, but in this case, there's no point in designing two things and then showing one person one thing and the other person the other thing. You're going to end up with ripping
So
your
it's a
hair out.
premature optimization.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
When you design the apps, did you incorporate gestures into the prototyping?
Well, that's what we're going to do in the next.
Oh.
Do you want to be my next?
Okay, sure.
Okay. All right. So now, same exact design. I didn't want to hand draw it because I was lazy. So I just decided to show the paper. But this time, we're going to do an interaction design, or sorry, an interaction test. So Anna.
Yeah.
Whatever you want.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you can just tell me which one you want to click.
Okay, I guess sign up for free.
Okay?
Yeah, so I guess whenever I touch one of the bars, like a screen will pop up.
Right.
Click register.
Okay. Yeah, and you could make this really nuanced, right? You could be like, when they click on this, then it takes you to another page and the keyboard shows up. Like, you could do that level, but, like, okay, let's not. I didn't want to waste time doing that. Okay.
Yeah, like screen off is me. I guess when I see here, so I guess like this would mean where all the members are, I guess. Or, I guess for me, like, if I have members, then I'd be willing to I want to scroll, some certain scroll through the attendance list.
Okay. So just as a side, I put this blank screen here on purpose because I wanted when people dive in, I want them to be like blank screen, and then I want to have the question of, well, what would you like to first see when you dig into the app? Do you want to see a tutorial that guides you through? Do you want to see the latest stats? So I didn't design it yet, just as a conversation point. You can do the same thing in your tests, okay?
Yeah, so like I said, I would want to be like a list of members, and then some.
But this is, you just signed up.
Okay. Add members.
Okay.
For add members to current.
Okay.
Add.
So maybe like a button here that says add members.
Yeah.
Okay.
Add events or some sort of class.
Okay.
Sort of have a place to fill out user profile.
Okay. Do you want to click on anything else?
Would it be necessary to have these down here?
You tell me. The product is for you. You're the studio owner.
Okay.
I'm just, the builder.
I think those three were the things I want.
Okay.
The bottom part bothers me
Okay.
when I initially signed it because you want to create a user interface. You want to create it so you populate the app, populate the app with your personal data.
Okay.
Yeah, I think afterwards. After I finish all this data, then I want to see sort of the list of courses that I'm teaching.
Okay.
Also to see a list of, first you see a list of courses, so you don't add members initially, and then with those courses you start adding students who already signed up to take your class.
Okay.
Yeah.
But don't you think that would take a lot of time to go and enter? Let's say you teach. You told me in the interview you teach 10 classes a week. Do you want to go in and enter all those 10 classes first, or do you want something that just quickly adds them as you're on the go? I don't know. You tell me. Which one would you prefer?
I'm sorry. I think definitely on the go. I guess like probably like if you have the new course, probably you want to enter it like before the first day, so that's sort of on the go.
Right.
And then be able to add your members like so it helps you prepare for your first day class.
Sure. Okay, I see that. Okay. All right. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you for your feedback. All right. Does this make sense to people? Sort of the two things. So we're going to start just doing the paper, and we got a lot of feedback just from paper, right? We didn't even have to like build a whole interaction. And then once we built the interaction, then we went and we got some more feedback, right? Usually it's going to be that once you get the feedback from the paper, you'll go and refine the design before you do the interaction, but this just gives you an idea of what to expect. Okay? Any questions on this? Does everybody feel like they could not only design, but go out and talk to people, get them to give you quality feedback?
No, I don't feel. Wait, sorry, I don't feel that way. But I just had a question as far as this testing stage. So, what if it was like a two-way interaction where, for example, like you have the list of the classes you teach, and then like the students have a different version of the app where they check into the classes they go to? Would you test on both sides?
Yes.
At the same time and make two different?
Yes. Yes. So remember I said you're going to test every user segment. So now if I've got this app, right, for the studio owner, I might have a second app for the customers. I've got to go test both of them out, right? Okay. Or I might be like, wow, that's a lot of work. Let me just start with the teachers first and see how they react. Because if they don't even like it, then who cares about the students, right? So I might pick one of the segments to do first.
Pick the most important one and then.
Yeah, and then in the future that you're going to maybe need to build something for the customer as well.
Yeah. Is this similar to the decision maker and user problem where if we end up picking the second one that Connie suggested, in that case the user would be the customer, but the decision maker is still the studio owner? So that's why.
Oh! I see what you're saying. Sorry, yes and no. So there are times where you can sort of pull in the studio by saying, hey, look, there are all these customers that I interviewed that say they want you to like use an app like this to take attendance, and then they can log in and they can see their information as well, right? So sometimes you can use that to sway the studio owner as well. Okay? Okay. Or vice versa. You could say like, hey, student, like your studio owner thinks that because you come so much or you're so connected, you should use this app. Okay? Any other questions on testing? Okay. So, like I said, we're going to collect the feedback and then we're going to do another iteration. If you want to do it again on paper, that's fine. If you want to do it, sometimes like if you get such negative feedback, then you might just decide, I'm not going to bother building out a whole interaction, because the interactive part does take a little while, but instead I'm just going to go back and redo the whole thing on paper again and then go back and talk to the person. Okay, and then we did the interaction testing already. So the goal with the interaction testing at this point is, once again, to validate the workflows, but to also validate some of the data flows. Okay, I know we didn't really show that very well here, but it came out of Anna saying, why is there nothing on this screen? Or, I'd want to see my student list here, right? Those are all data flows. So think about that kind of feedback that you get from the businesses, the people that you do usability testing with. Okay, ready for demo? So the tools that you're going to use Balsamiq, right? And I think we've only set up one project. So as you all have your teams, what I'll do is I'll create a space for each team, and then you can have your own little project that you can build off of, because it's all in the cloud, right? The one that I showed you was a desktop application, but that costs $80. So the online version is free for education. And then the other is InVision. I don't know how many of you have used InVision. So basically, InVision is great because what you can do is, and I don't know how many of you are going to do this, but you've got your app, right? All the things that you've created, and then you want to be able to share all of those screens, and you don't just want to like transfer files or whatever. You can actually put them all into InVision, and then they can see what the files look like. So I'll just do a quick example here for you so that you can see. Like you can just say, hey, log in and look at the balsamic mock-ups that I did. So for example here, like someone can log in and see each of these different screens. Okay. And then you can also, the cool thing about this is you can do revisioning. So you can say, hey, here was like the first version that we did, and then here's the second version, or if you decide to do A/B testing or whatever, or if you've got 2 different groups that you're testing, you can create all those versions here. So it's just a nicer way to organize your workspace. The other thing is that it'll also keep track of all of those iterations. So if you started with paper, then you did balsamic, then you did, like I said, high fidelity with color and all of that in something like Photoshop, you can put those all in here. The other reason that I like to use InVision is because you don't want to give your balsamic files to your customers. So if you ever want to send them anything, like if you do client work for a business, right, you don't want them to have the hard files. They're going to go in and like change things, and that's not necessary. So using something like InVision, they can just log in and see all of the nice things that you've done and see that you're doing work for them. Okay. All right. And then also wanted to talk to you about Verify. So I would wait to sign up for this because it's like a 30-day trial. But the reason I put this up here is that I know there might be some of you who say, I'm not designing something for Duke students. I want to get the general public to give me feedback. And using something like Verify, you can actually specify who you want to test your app, and it'll be just these line testers that will give you feedback, kind of like a focus group. Okay? And that will be one of your lab assignments. All right. So, just to recap, we talked about how stories go to features, right? And the main thing we talked about in the beginning was we've got all these stories, and then they start to actually, grow in number because why? Why do they start to grow in number?
Because we tell you what's wrong.
No, that's before people tell you what's wrong. Yeah, they certainly grow in number when you get to these 2 phases, but how can they grow in number just in the beginning?
Because you learn about the complexity of what they do.
Right. You learn about the complexity, right? There might be more nuances. There might be data that you have to model. There might be compound tasks or vague verbs or all of these things where now your story list that you thought was just 3 is now 30. Okay? And then what else did we say we need to do if that happens?
Prioritize.
Right. We're going to prioritize the stories and figure out what's most important. But sometimes we can't prioritize, right? Why can't we prioritize?
Because we don't have enough data.
Okay, because we don't have enough data. Sometimes we have to put infrastructure in, right? We've got to get the students in before we can take attendance and all of that, like that example I gave. Okay, and then we talked about usability testing, right? And there's sort of two flavors of usability testing. But why is it that we're doing usability testing to begin with?
So that we don't make wrong assumptions during the development process.
Okay, what else? What's the goal of usability testing?
We know what they want.
Okay, what else?
To get feedback about your design.
Right, get feedback on design. That's the main thing here that we're looking for, is we want to have clarity in feedback. We want to make sure that whatever came out of that interview, right, in terms of what was important, tasks, preferences, all of that, we've captured it in a very simple design that they can play with, and then they can tell us, yeah, you're totally on the right track, or this is totally off base. This is not what I wanted. I don't like iPhone apps. Go build something else, right? So it gives you a sense of what it is that you need to do in order to improve your design and eventually your product. Okay, and then we talked about the 2 forms. So why do we use paper?
Because it's easy to draw everything.
Okay.
And everybody understands how to use paper.
Right. Okay, and then finally interaction testing, right, when people can get in there and actually pick what it is that they want to use. Okay, any questions on this? Okay, this is sort of what you'll be doing, actually this is exactly what you'll be doing. think the next lab. So what is that? Lab 3. You'll have to go in and design your. Actually, no. Maybe it's lab 3. Maybe it's lab 4. I forget. One of the two labs. After you do your customer interviews, right, and then you start to get the feedback, then you're going to design those. Do you have a question? Are you just waiting? Okay. Yeah.
Were you about to wrap up? Or?
I'm done. Yes.
Okay, I was going to ask. No, I didn't mean to.
Are you done?
I didn't mean to rush you, but I didn't want to cut in. So on Lab 2, Assignment 1, one of the questions is positioning in the market.
Yeah.
What exactly are you referring to in terms of the competitor's position in the market?
Right. What's their position? Are they a luxury product?
Oh, okay.
Are they a lifestyle, but they're like the nice people like Honda versus
Gotcha.
the Harley people? Right. What's your competitor's positioning? Like as detailed as you can be about their position, the better.
Okay.
Okay. So not just price, but overall perception. How do users feel? Okay. Anything else? All right. Well, then I will see you all next week.
Yeah.